Hello everyone. Before the story start, tell me where are you watching from and what time is it?
I didn't expect anyone to ever hear this. I'm not even sure I want anyone to. But if you're listening now, it means the footage was finally released, or leaked, or maybe just quietly passed from one tired hand to another. What I'm about to describe isn't speculation or theory. It's not a story I invented to scare myself during long nights. It's a memory, and like all real memories, it doesn't unfold cleanly. It lingers. It loops. It changes how you hear silence. I worked the night shift for a small logistics facility on the edge of an industrial zone, far enough from the city that the rain always sounded louder there. The building was old but functional, a long concrete rectangle with metal shutters, humming fluorescent lights, and a control room that smelled faintly of dust, burnt coffee, and overheated electronics. My job was simple: monitor the CCTV feeds, log anything unusual, and respond if an alarm triggered. 99% of the time, nothing happened. Trucks came and went. The rain fell. Screens flickered. I stayed awake. That night was no different at first. Rain pressed steadily against the roof, a soft, constant drumming that blurred time. The monitors glowed in front of me, 12 camera feeds arranged in a grid. Loading bays, hallways, storage aisles, the exterior fence line. Everything looked the way it always did: empty, still, slightly warped by cheap lenses and low light. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, in a lonely sort of way. Like the building itself was asleep, breathing slowly through the hum of electricity. Around 2:17 a.m., I noticed movement on camera 6. It covered the far end of corridor B, a long, narrow hallway rarely used at night. At first, I assumed it was a lighting glitch. The shadows there tended to stretch when the rain intensified. But then the movement resolved into a shape, tall, thin, standing just at the edge of the frame. It wasn't walking. It wasn't entering. It was already there, as if it had always been there and I had only just noticed. I leaned closer to the screen. The shape didn't move the way a person does. There was no sway, no shifting of weight. It stood perfectly still, yet the image around it felt unsettled, like the air itself was slightly out of alignment. The corridor lights flickered once, softly, and for a brief moment I thought the figure had disappeared. But when the light stabilized, it was closer to the camera. I checked the timestamp. Only a few seconds had passed. I told myself it was a person, maybe a coworker, maybe someone who shouldn't be there. The idea of a trespasser was comforting compared to the alternative forming quietly in my mind. I switched to another camera angle, one that intersected corridor B from the side. The hallway was empty. Completely empty. No figure. No movement. Just rainwater leaking through a crack in the ceiling, dripping steadily onto the floor. When I switched back to camera 6, the figure was closer still. Close enough now that I could make out details, or at least the suggestion of them. It had the rough outline of a human body, 2 arms, 2 legs, head, but everything about it felt wrong. The proportions were slightly off, like someone trying to remember what a person looked like and failing in small but important ways. The head was tilted forward, not enough to seem intentional, just enough to suggest attention. The sound in the control room seemed to change then. The rain grew softer, as if it were falling farther away. The hum of the monitors deepened. I became aware of my own breathing, slow and careful, as though any sudden sound might carry through the screens themselves. I reached for the radio to call security, then stopped. I don't know why. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like a sense that involving another person would break something delicate, like interrupting a half-remembered dream. I kept watching. The figure began to move. It didn't walk down the corridor. Instead, it advanced in small, irregular increments, each one too subtle to register as motion until it had already happened. It was closer, then closer again, without ever crossing the space between. The camera timestamp ticked forward normally. The world insisted that time was passing as it should. My eyes told me something else. As it approached, the image quality degraded. Static crept into the corners of the screen, thin lines of interference sliding downward like rain inside the monitor. The figure's surface, skin, I suppose, looked uneven, as though it were made of overlapping shadows rather than solid matter. I couldn't see a face. Every time I tried to focus on where the eyes should be, the image blurred, refusing to settle. I checked the other cameras again. The building was empty. Every hallway, every loading bay, every exterior angle showed nothing but rain and stillness. Whatever this was, it existed only on camera 6. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten in a slow, cold way. The figure wasn't casting a shadow. The corridor lights behind it were bright enough that there should have been one, stretched long across the floor. There was nothing. Just clean, uninterrupted concrete beneath its feet. I whispered without realizing it. Just a single word, meant only for myself. The sound felt loud in the small room. The figure stopped. I don't mean it paused. I mean it reacted. The head lifted slightly, the tilt correcting by a fraction of a degree, as if it were orienting toward something. Toward me. The camera feed jittered, then stabilized. For the first time, I had the distinct impression that the thing on the screen was no longer being observed. It was observing. A low sound crept into the audio feed, barely audible beneath the rain. At first, I thought it was interference, feedback from a loose cable. But it had rhythm. Not words, not exactly. More like breath shaped by intention. A whisper that never quite formed sound. I muted the audio. The whisper didn't stop. It wasn't louder now. It wasn't coming from the speakers at all. It seemed to exist somewhere between the hum of the monitors and the quiet space behind my eyes. I pressed my hands flat against the desk, grounding myself in the feel of cold metal and dust. I reminded myself where I was. I reminded myself that screens can lie. The figure took another step without stepping. It was very close now. So close that the camera lens should have lost focus entirely. Instead, the image sharpened. Details emerged, not clearer, but more numerous. Folds where skin shouldn't fold. Lines that suggested joints in the wrong places. The suggestion of a mouth opening and closing too slowly to match any known rhythm of speech. The whisper grew more insistent, still soft, still almost gentle. I couldn't understand it, but I felt it press against old memories, half-formed thoughts, things I hadn't considered in years. It felt familiar in a way that made no sense, like hearing a lullaby you don't remember learning. Then the figure leaned forward. The camera should not have been able to capture what happened next. The lens was fixed, bolted into the ceiling. And yet, the perspective changed. It was as if the thing on the screen had moved not closer to the camera, but closer to me. The background fell away. The corridor dissolved into grain and static. All that remained was the figure's upper body, filling the frame. Where its face should have been, there was movement. Not features, movement. Layers shifting, aligning, unaligning. I had the sudden, overwhelming certainty that if it ever finished arranging itself, I would understand something I was never meant to understand. Something irreversible. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the screen was dark. Camera 6 showed only black, the timestamp still ticking forward. No static. No corridor. Just absence. The other cameras were unchanged, still and empty, rain falling patiently outside. I sat there for a long time. I don't know how long. The control room clock said only a few minutes had passed, but my body felt heavy, exhausted, like I'd been awake for days. Eventually, I stood, unplugged the monitor for camera 6, and wrote a brief log entry, temporary camera failure. Investigate in morning. I didn't investigate in the morning. I didn't come back the next night, either. I quit without explanation. The footage was flagged, archived, forgotten. Or so I thought. Months later, I received an email from someone in IT. He said they'd recovered the last recorded data from camera 6 before it went dark. He asked if I wanted a copy, for closure. I never replied. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain is steady and the world feels thin, I imagine what that last frame must show. I imagine the thing finally finishing whatever it was doing. I imagine it looking straight through the lens, straight through the years, into the quiet space where someone like you might be listening now. And I wonder if the reason it didn't follow me, if the reason it stayed on that screen, is because it realized something. That it didn't need to leave the footage. That eventually, someone would press play. I found the house by accident, though I don't believe in accidents the way I used to. I was looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere temporary, a place to stay while I finished a backlog of remote work and tried to reset my sleep schedule. The listing was vague, too vague, really. No address in the description, no history, just a handful of photos that looked slightly washed out, as if they'd been taken through a thin fog. The price was low. That should have been the first warning, but the photos showed a clean, modest home surrounded by trees, and the comments, few as they were neutral in a way that felt reassuring. Peaceful. Isolated. Good for rest. The directions arrived the morning of my drive. They weren't GPS coordinates, just written instructions that grew less precise the farther I went. Turn left after the old water tower. Continue until the road narrows. Ignore the broken sign. When I finally reached the end of the gravel path, the house was waiting in a clearing that looked carefully maintained and strangely untouched at the same time. The lawn was trimmed, the windows intact, the paint only mildly weathered. It didn't look abandoned. It didn't look lived in either. It looked paused. Rain had started an hour before I arrived, light and steady, the kind that never fully soaks you but never lets you forget it's there. The sound followed me as I stepped out of the car, a soft hiss against leaves and soil. The air smelled clean, almost sterile, like it had been rinsed too many times. I stood for a moment with my keys in hand, listening. No birds. No insects. Just rain, and the faint creak of the house settling as if it were aware of my presence. Inside, everything was furnished, but impersonally so. Neutral colors. No clutter. No photographs. The furniture felt chosen to suggest comfort rather than provide it. The walls were bare except for the faint outlines where something had once hung and been carefully removed. I noticed that immediately, though I couldn't have said why it bothered me. People move all the time. They take things with them. Still, the absence felt deliberate, like an effort rather than a result. I unpacked slowly, the rain continuing outside with a patience that felt almost intentional. My phone had a weak signal, enough to send messages if I stood near a window, not enough to browse or distract myself. That suited me fine. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone. The first night passed without incident. I slept deeply, the sound of rain threading through my dreams. When I woke, I felt rested in a way I hadn't in months, but also faintly disoriented, like I'd slept longer than I remembered. The clock insisted otherwise. Everything insisted otherwise. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Work in the mornings. Walk the property in the afternoons. Read in the evenings while the rain came and went. It rained often there, I realized. Not storms, just steady, background rain that softened the world and blurred edges. The forest around the clearing felt dense but not wild, the trees evenly spaced, their branches trimmed high enough to let light through. It felt curated. Maintained by someone who no longer came. It was on the fourth day that I noticed the marks on the doorframe. They were subtle, shallow grooves carved into the wood near the kitchen entrance. At first glance, they looked like the kind of damage furniture makes over time, chairs bumped too often, something dragged in and out. But when I looked closer, the grooves were too uniform. Too intentional. They ran vertically, grouped in clusters of 4, repeating at regular intervals up the frame. I traced one set with my finger. The wood was smooth, worn down by repeated contact. I tried to imagine what might have caused it. Children, maybe. A family with kids who liked to measure their height. That thought lingered longer than it should have, warming the space around it. The idea of a family made the house feel less strange. More normal. That night, I dreamed of voices. Not words. Just the sense of voices, layered and overlapping, murmuring softly as rain tapped against unseen windows. In the dream, I was sitting in the living room, the lights low, the furniture arranged differently. There were shapes moving at the edge of my vision, smaller shapes, and the impression of familiarity pressed against my chest. When I woke, my heart felt heavy, like I'd been interrupted in the middle of remembering something important. The next morning, I searched the house more thoroughly. I don't know what I expected to find. Evidence, maybe. Something to confirm the feeling that had begun to settle in me, the quiet certainty that the house had once been full. I checked closets, drawers, cabinets. Everything was empty, but clean. Not the hollow emptiness of abandonment, but the careful emptiness of removal. Someone had taken great care to leave nothing behind. In the basement, I found a storage room with shelves lining the walls. Dust coated everything evenly, except for a rectangular patch on the floor where something large had once sat. A table, maybe. Or a cabinet. The outline was precise, undisturbed, like a memory preserved in negative space. That was when I decided to look up the property. The address wasn't listed online. That wasn't unusual for rural areas, but even public records turned up nothing. No sales history. No construction permits. No tax assessments. It was as if the house existed slightly outside the systems designed to track such things. I widened the search, looking for mentions of the road, the area, anything that might anchor the place to a timeline. I found nothing. At first, I felt a flicker of unease. Then curiosity took over. I told myself records get lost all the time. Fires, floods, administrative errors. But the more I searched, the more complete the absence felt. There were no gaps where information should have been. Just smooth, uninterrupted nothing. That evening, the rain returned heavier than usual, a soft roar that filled the spaces between thoughts. I sat by the window and watched the clearing blur, the trees dissolving into shades of gray. That was when I noticed movement near the edge of the forest. Not a person. Just a shift, a suggestion of something withdrawing as I focused on it. I blinked, and it was gone. Over the next few days, small things began to change. Objects weren't moving exactly, not in ways I could point to. It was more that they felt different when I returned to a room. A chair angled slightly more toward the table. A book left open to a page I didn't remember reading. Once, I found a glass of water on the kitchen counter, half full, condensation beading along the side. I don't drink water from glasses there. I use a bottle. Each time, I told myself I was tired. Distracted. Letting imagination fill in gaps. The rain didn't help. It softened time, made days slide into one another. Sometimes I would lose track of how long I'd been sitting, listening, thinking. The dreams grew clearer. I began to see faces, though they never resolved fully. A woman standing near the sink, her back to me. A man in the living room, sitting too still. Children, always children, moving through the house with the easy confidence of belonging. They never spoke. They didn't need to. Their presence carried a quiet certainty, a sense that this was how things were meant to be. One night, I dreamed I was standing in the hallway, watching as marks appeared on the doorframe, one by one, as a child grew. I felt pride. I felt fear. I felt the strange, aching awareness that time was moving too fast and not fast enough. I woke with tears on my face and no memory of why. The sound of footsteps became noticeable around then. Not loud. Just soft, measured steps moving through the house when I was still. Always at night. Always accompanied by the rain. I would lie in bed and listen, my breathing shallow, as the steps paused outside my door and then continued on, as if following a route I didn't understand. I never saw anyone. One afternoon, I found a drawing tucked behind a loose baseboard in the living room. It was done in pencil on yellowed paper, the lines faint but deliberate. It showed the house, simplified but recognizable, with stick figures standing in front. 4 of them. 2 tall. 2 small. Their faces were blank, but the space around them was filled in dark, heavy strokes, as if the child who'd drawn it had pressed too hard. On the back, there was a date. It was decades old. I searched again for records, this time focusing on people rather than property. Missing persons. Old census data. School enrollments. I widened the net until it felt absurd, until I was chasing ghosts in databases that had no reason to connect. Still, nothing surfaced. No family that matched the drawing. No names tied to the area. No indication that anyone had ever lived there at all. And yet, the house remembered. I could feel it in the way the rooms held warmth, in the way the floorboards creaked predictably underfoot, as if accustomed to certain patterns of movement. The kitchen smelled faintly of old meals when the rain was heavy, a layered scent of things cooked slowly, often. The hallway felt narrower at night, the walls closer, like they were leaning in to listen. The whispers began shortly after. They were not voices in the conventional sense. More like the impression of voices carried by the sound of rain, shaped by memory rather than sound. They came when I was nearly asleep, when my thoughts had loosened their grip. They spoke in feelings. In familiarity. In the quiet certainty of being expected. "You're home," they seemed to say. I started to feel guilty about leaving lights on in empty rooms. About closing doors. About sitting in spaces that didn't feel like they were meant for me. I would lie in bed and listen, my breathing shallow, as the steps paused outside my door and then continued on, as if following a route I didn't understand. I never saw anyone. One afternoon, I found a drawing tucked behind a loose baseboard in the living room. It was done in pencil on yellowed paper, the lines faint but deliberate. It showed the house, simplified but recognizable, with stick figures standing in front. 4 of them. 2 tall. 2 small. Their faces were blank, but the space around them was filled in dark, heavy strokes, as if the child who'd drawn it had pressed too hard. On the back, there was a date. It was decades old. I searched again for records, this time focusing on people rather than property. Missing persons. Old census data. School enrollments. I widened the net until it felt absurd, until I was chasing ghosts in databases that had no reason to connect. Still, nothing surfaced. No family that matched the drawing. No names tied to the area. No indication that anyone had ever lived there at all. And yet, the house remembered. I could feel it in the way the rooms held warmth, in the way the floorboards creaked predictably underfoot, as if accustomed to certain patterns of movement. The kitchen smelled faintly of old meals when the rain was heavy, a layered scent of things cooked slowly, often. The hallway felt narrower at night, the walls closer, like they were leaning in to listen. The whispers began shortly after. They were not voices in the conventional sense. More like the impression of voices carried by the sound of rain, shaped by memory rather than sound. They came when I was nearly asleep, when my thoughts had loosened their grip. They spoke in feelings. In familiarity. In the quiet certainty of being expected. "You're home," they seemed to say. I started to feel guilty about leaving lights on in empty rooms. About closing doors. About sitting in spaces that didn't feel like they were meant for me. I took the night guard job because it was easy and because no one else wanted it. The posting had been up for months, quietly cycling through job boards with the same vague description and the same unusually flexible requirements. Overnight security at a decommissioned municipal complex. Minimal activity. Long hours. Solitude encouraged. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and at the time, I needed something that wouldn't ask too much of me. I didn't want conversation. I didn't want daylight. I wanted time to pass without being noticed. The complex sat at the edge of town where the streetlights thinned out and the road grew uneven. It had once housed several administrative departments before the city consolidated everything into a newer building closer to the center. Now it stood mostly empty, a cluster of low concrete structures connected by covered walkways, their windows dark, their signage faded but still legible if you looked long enough. The rain always seemed heavier there, as if the place drew it in. It drummed softly on the roofs, slid down the windows, pooled in shallow reflections that never quite dried. My shift began at 11 p.m. The first night, the supervisor met me at the gate, handed over a ring of keys, and walked me through the basics. Checkpoints every hour. Monitor the cameras. Log anything unusual. He spoke calmly, professionally, like someone reciting something he'd said many times before. When I asked how long the site would remain staffed, he hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "As long as it needs to be," he said, then glanced at his watch and added, "You'll be alone after midnight." The guard office was small and windowless, tucked near the central corridor. It held a desk, a chair, a bank of monitors, and a time clock mounted on the wall. The clock was old-fashioned, the kind that used physical punch cards instead of digital scans. A stack of blank cards sat neatly beside it. My name was already printed on one. I remember thinking that was oddly considerate. The first few nights were uneventful. Quiet, even comforting. The rain provided a constant backdrop, softening the silence and making the hours feel less empty. I made my rounds, checked doors that never opened, hallways that smelled faintly of dust and old paper, offices frozen in time with calendars still flipped to their final month. The cameras showed nothing but empty corridors and rain-streaked exteriors. I logged my checkpoints, punched my card at the start and end of each shift, and went home as the sky began to lighten. It was on the fifth night that I noticed the extra name. I was filing the previous shift's paperwork when I saw it on the clipboard near the desk. A sign-in sheet, standard enough, with columns for name, time in, time out. My name appeared where it should, each entry neat and consistent. Beneath it, written in a careful, slightly slanted hand, was another name. I didn't recognize it. The time in column was filled. The time out column was blank. I assumed it was an old entry that hadn't been cleared. Someone who'd worked there before me. Still, the date was current. That night's date. I checked the time clock. There was only one card punched in. Mine. I told myself it was a clerical error. Something left over from the transition between guards. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady whisper against the walls. I focused on my screens, letting the familiarity of routine settle me. Around 2:30 a.m., camera 4 flickered. It covered the east wing, a section of the complex that had been closed off due to structural concerns. I wasn't supposed to patrol it, only monitor it remotely. The flicker was brief, just a ripple of static that cleared almost immediately. When the image returned, the hallway looked the same as always, dim, empty, lined with closed doors. Except for the figure standing at the far end. At first, I thought it was a reflection. A trick of light. But the longer I looked, the more defined it became. A person in a security uniform, standing perfectly still beneath a flickering fluorescent light. The uniform was outdated, the cut slightly wrong, but unmistakable. A guard. My first reaction was relief. Then confusion. No one had told me I'd have a partner. I checked the other cameras. No movement anywhere else. I switched back to camera 4. The figure was closer. Not walking. Just closer, as if the space between frames had been folded. The timestamp showed only seconds had passed. I leaned forward, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. The figure's face was turned slightly downward, features obscured by shadow. The posture was relaxed, familiar, like someone waiting for the next round. I reached for the radio. Hello? My voice sounded too loud in the small office. There was no response. The radio crackled softly, then went quiet. The figure didn't move again. It simply remained there, occupying the hallway with a patience that felt practiced. After a while, I noticed something else. It wasn't casting a shadow. The light above it flickered, but the floor beneath remained evenly lit. Eventually, the feed cut to static. I sat back, heart steady but heavy, and told myself the system was old. Prone to glitches. That I'd imagined the rest. The rain didn't let up. It never does there. The name appeared again the next night. Same handwriting. Same blank timeout. This time, it was written more firmly, as if whoever had signed it wanted to be sure it stayed. I didn't erase it. Over the following weeks, small things accumulated. A chair in the guard office angled slightly toward the door when I was sure I'd left it facing the desk. A second coffee cup in the sink, still warm. Footsteps in the corridor during my rounds that stopped when I stopped. Always soft. Always unhurried. The cameras began to show more. The figure appeared in different wings, never on more than one feed at a time. Always standing. Always waiting. Sometimes closer to the camera. Sometimes just at the edge of the frame, where the image blurred. I never saw it walk. I never saw it leave. One night, I found an old incident log tucked behind a filing cabinet. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the entries were meticulous. They detailed routine shifts, weather conditions, nothing unusual. Until the last page. Guard on duty did not clock out, it read. Search conducted. No signs of forced exit. Time card still punched in. There was no follow-up. After that, the whispers began. They came with the rain, threading through its steady sound. Not voices, not exactly. More like the memory of voices. The sense of someone speaking from just behind you, close enough that you could feel the intention if not the words. They didn't frighten me at first. They felt familiar. Like instructions remembered from long practice. Check the doors. Log the time. Stay until morning. One night, I fell asleep at the desk. When I woke, the office lights were off. The monitors glowed softly, showing empty hallways. The rain continued outside, unchanged. The time clock ticked steadily on the wall. My time card was already punched. I checked the time. 10:58 p.m. I hadn't arrived yet. I tried to leave after that. I really did. But each time I reached the gate, it was locked, the key heavy and uncooperative in my hand. The radio never worked when I needed it. My phone showed no signal, no matter where I stood. The rain made everything feel distant, muted, like the world beyond the fence was only a suggestion. The figure appeared more often then. Sometimes in reflections. Sometimes just behind me on the cameras. Once, I saw it standing in the guard office doorway, head tilted, watching me fill out the log. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew it was there. I began to understand. The job wasn't meant to be temporary. It was a role, passed quietly from one tired person to the next. The city didn't keep records because it didn't need to. The complex needed a presence. Someone to notice it. Someone to stay when everyone else left. Someone who wouldn't clock out. The last entry in the log is in my handwriting now. It's neat. Careful. The timeout column is blank. Sometimes, when the rain is especially steady, I think I see movement on the edge of the screens. A new figure, standing just outside the gate, waiting for a chance to step inside. Waiting for someone else to take the shift. I hope they're better at leaving than I was. Because the clock is still running. And the night is very long. It started with the rain, the way these things often do. Not a storm, not thunder, just that steady, patient rainfall that fills the quiet spaces and makes time feel thicker. The house had been in my family for generations, a narrow two-story place with aging brick walls and deep-set windows that never quite let in enough light. When my parents moved out and left it to me, they warned me about the sounds. Old houses settle, they said. Pipes knock. Walls breathe. I believed them. I wanted to believe them. The first night I stayed there alone, I slept lightly, wrapped in the familiar creaks and sighs of wood adjusting to cold. Rain whispered against the roof, ran softly through the gutters, tapped the windows with delicate insistence. It was comforting in a way, like the house was reminding me it was still alive. When I heard the faint knocking, I barely registered it. 3 soft taps, slow and evenly spaced, coming from somewhere behind the bedroom wall. I assumed it was plumbing. I rolled over and let sleep take me again. The knocking returned the next night, and the night after that. Always the same rhythm. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. Never loud. Never urgent. Just persistent enough to pull my attention from whatever I was doing. When I pressed my ear to the wall, the sound seemed to retreat, as if it were aware of being listened to. The rain outside never stopped, and eventually the two sounds blended together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I mentioned it to my sister when she came to visit. She stood in the hallway, arms crossed, listening with a skeptical tilt to her head. When the knocking came, faint but unmistakable, her expression changed. Not fear, exactly. More like discomfort. She suggested mice, or maybe an old heating duct. Something small and alive inside the walls. The explanation felt thin, but I accepted it. I needed to. A week later, my neighbors mentioned it without prompting. They asked if I'd been doing renovations, if I'd had contractors over late at night. They said they'd heard knocking too, muffled through the shared wall, usually after midnight. It had woken them more than once. I apologized, though I didn't understand what I was apologizing for. The idea that the sound traveled outward unsettled me more than the sound itself. The knocking began to change after that. It wasn't louder, but it felt closer. Sometimes it came from the living room wall, sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes from the narrow stretch of wall behind the staircase. It never came from the same place twice in a row. I started mapping it mentally, noting where it appeared, how long it lasted. There was no pattern I could recognize, no logic that made sense. Only the rhythm remained consistent. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. One night, during a particularly heavy rainfall, I noticed something else. Between the sets of knocks, there was a sound like movement. Not scraping, not scratching. More like fabric brushing against brick. Slow, careful shifts, as if whatever was inside the wall was adjusting its position. The thought made my skin tighten. I pressed my palm flat against the plaster. It was cold. Solid. Unyielding. I called a contractor the next day. He was an older man, quiet, with hands worn smooth by years of work. He listened patiently as I explained, nodding along, offering practical reassurances. When the knocking came while he was there, his expression changed. He asked to see the basement, the crawl spaces, the places where walls met foundations. He found nothing. No signs of animals. No loose pipes. No structural damage. Before he left, he paused in the hallway and placed his ear against the wall. The rain had started again, soft and unending. Old houses remember things, he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he straightened, smiled apologetically, and told me to call if it got worse. It did. The knocking started happening during the day. Subtle, almost polite taps that interrupted conversations, cut through the sound of running water, followed me from room to room. I stopped inviting people over. I didn't want to explain it anymore. At night, lying in bed, I began to feel watched, not from outside, but from within the walls themselves. The house felt fuller somehow, like the empty spaces had been occupied by something patient and observant. I began dreaming of narrow spaces. Of pressing my face against brick, of breathing shallowly so the walls wouldn't notice me. In the dreams, the rain was always there, seeping through cracks, cooling the stone, masking every sound except the knocking. When I woke, my heart would be racing, my ears straining to tell dream from waking. One night, the knocking came from directly behind my headboard. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The taps were so close I could feel them through the wall, faint vibrations traveling into the frame of the bed. Between the knocks, I heard something that made my throat tighten, a sound like a slow exhale, drawn out and careful, as if whoever was breathing didn't have much space. I slept with the lights on after that. I started researching the house. Old permits. Newspaper archives. Anything that might explain the sounds. The records were incomplete, scattered. There were mentions of renovations that never seemed to finish, of rooms sealed off and later reopened. One article from decades ago mentioned a family who'd lived there briefly before leaving suddenly. No details. No explanation. Just a note that the house had stood empty for several years afterward. The knocking grew more insistent, though it never broke its rhythm. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between taps, I thought I heard words forming. Not clearly. Just the shape of them, pressed thin by brick and time. I would lean close, my ear against the wall, heart pounding softly in my chest. The sound would stop, as if listening back. The neighbors complained again. Louder this time. They said the knocking kept them awake, that it sounded intentional, deliberate. They asked if someone was trapped inside the walls. The question lingered in the air long after they'd gone. I tried to tear the wall open once. Just a small section, enough to see inside. The plaster resisted, tougher than it should have been. When the first crack formed, the knocking stopped completely. The silence that followed was immense, pressing down on me until my ears rang. I stepped back, suddenly unsure. The rain outside softened, as if waiting. I patched the wall. I told myself I'd imagined the resistance, the way the house seemed to hold itself together. That night, the knocking resumed. But this time, it was different. It came from all around me. Every wall. Every corner. A soft, synchronized tapping that filled the house with quiet insistence. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Over and over, like a language I was finally beginning to understand. The rain outside matched the rhythm perfectly, a vast, patient echo. I sat on the floor in the center of the living room, surrounded by the sound. I felt calm. Strangely calm. The fear had worn itself thin, replaced by a heavy, sinking understanding. Whatever was inside the walls wasn't trying to get out. It was trying to be heard. Now, when the rain falls, I listen. I don't fight the knocking anymore. I let it wash over me, let it fill the spaces the house has made for it. Sometimes I tap back, gently, carefully, matching the rhythm. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. The neighbors have stopped complaining. They say the house sounds quieter now. Settled. But at night, when the rain is steady and the walls feel close, I can tell the difference between the sound of water and the sound of something listening from just the other side of the brick. And I know the house is no longer empty. It never really was.
Please like the video and subscribe to my channel.
The first thing I noticed was the smell, even before the door opened. Not decay, not rot, something older and cleaner than that. Like antiseptic that had soaked into concrete and never fully faded. It drifted out through the cracks around the seal, thin and dry, untouched by time. The rain outside tapped softly against the hospital's upper windows, a constant background hush that made the night feel distant and unreal. I'd worked at the hospital for nearly 6 years by then. Night administration. Paperwork, inventory checks, the quiet maintenance of a building that never truly slept. Everyone knew about the sealed floor. 4th floor, east wing. You could see where it had been closed off, thick fire doors, welded shut, warning signs bleached almost white by time. No one talked about it unless they had to. When they did, their voices lowered without anyone suggesting it. The official explanation was simple: structural issues after a fire. Unsafe. Too expensive to repair. Easier to seal it and move on. Hospitals are good at that, closing doors, redirecting hallways, pretending something never existed. And for 20 years, it worked. Until the rain started leaking through the ceiling on the 3rd floor. Maintenance traced it upward. Pipes ran through the sealed section. To fix the leak, someone had to go in. Administration delayed it as long as possible, but water doesn't care about comfort or superstition. Eventually, the order came down quietly: unseal the floor, assess damage, reseal when finished. I wasn't meant to be involved. But that night, 2 staff members called in sick, and suddenly I was asked to accompany maintenance, just to log inventory and document access. That was the phrase they used. Document access. As if the floor were still part of the hospital in any meaningful way. The welding took longer than expected. Sparks hissed softly against metal, bright and brief in the dim corridor. When the doors finally loosened, they didn't swing open. They resisted, heavy and stubborn, like they hadn't been meant to move again. It took all 3 of us pushing together to create a narrow gap. The air that slipped out was cool and still. Inside, the lights were off. Emergency strips along the floor flickered weakly when power was rerouted, casting a low amber glow that barely reached the walls. The corridor stretched ahead, long and narrow, identical to every other hospital floor: linoleum tiles, handrails, numbered doors. But everything looked paused. Dust lay evenly across surfaces, undisturbed, as if time had stopped rather than passed. And yet, the floor was clean. No debris. No collapsed ceiling tiles. No signs of neglect beyond dust. Wheelchairs stood neatly against the walls. A gurney rested halfway out of a room, sheets folded with careful precision. White boards still held faint writing beneath newer ghost lines, names and dates pressed so deeply into the surface they had refused to leave. One of the maintenance workers muttered that it looked like people had just stepped away. I didn't like how true that felt. We moved slowly. Every footstep sounded too loud, echoing down corridors that had not heard movement in 2 decades. The rain above us softened the silence, distant but constant, like the building was breathing through its roof. Room numbers climbed in familiar order. Patient rooms. Storage. A nurse's station at the center of the wing. Papers still lay on the desk there, clipped and organized. A half-empty cup sat beside a stack of forms, its rim stained faintly brown. No mold. No smell. Just waiting. I checked dates where I could. Charts. Labels. Everything ended on the same day. 20 years ago. Exactly. No gradual tapering off. No slow evacuation. One day full. The next, nothing. We didn't talk about it out loud, but I could feel the others noticing the same thing. The way the floor seemed to expect us. The way doors stood slightly ajar, as if someone had meant to come back and close them later. The leak was easy to find. A pipe joint near the far end of the wing had finally given up. Rust bloomed faintly around the seam, the only real sign of age we'd seen. While maintenance worked, I logged room numbers and took photos, my footsteps carrying me deeper into the sealed section than I intended. That's when I heard it. Not a voice. Not exactly. A sound like fabric shifting. Slow. Careful. Somewhere ahead of me, beyond the curve of the corridor. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I told myself it was the building settling. Old structures make noises when disturbed. Everyone knows that. Still, I stayed where I was, listening. The rain continued its soft pattern above us, steady and reassuring. Then a light flickered on. Room 417. It wasn't bright, just the faint overhead glow of a hospital fixture coming to life. I hadn't touched a switch. No one had. I stood frozen, heart steady but heavy, watching the rectangle of light spill into the hallway. I approached slowly. The door was open. Inside, the room was perfectly arranged. Bed made. Tray table pushed in. Curtains drawn halfway, though there was nothing beyond the window but darkness and rain. On the bedside table sat a clipboard. The chart inside was thick. The patient name meant nothing to me. The notes were dense, handwritten in careful script. I skimmed without meaning to, phrases rising out of the page uninvited. Unresponsive but stable. No family contact. Continue monitoring. The last entry was time-stamped late in the evening. There was no discharge note. I felt it then, a presence. Not behind me. Not beside me. Around me. As if the room itself were aware I was there. The light above hummed softly, a sound just shy of silence. I backed away. In the hallway, more lights were coming on. One by one. Not all of them. Just enough to suggest occupancy. A nurse's station monitor blinked to life, its screen washed in pale blue. Down the corridor, I heard a cartwheel turn slightly, metal whispering against tile. I called out. Just once. A quiet, instinctive sound. Nothing answered. But movement began. Doors opened a fraction. Curtains shifted. The shapes of beds and equipment seemed to rearrange themselves subtly, settling into use. The air grew warmer, carrying that unmistakable hospital scent, clean, controlled, human. The maintenance workers called my name from the other end of the wing. Their voices sounded distant, stretched thin by the space between us. I started toward them, my pace quickening despite myself. As I passed room 421, I saw someone inside. A figure lying in the bed, face turned away, body still beneath the sheets. I couldn't see details. The light was too low. But I knew with a certainty that sank deep into my chest, that the bed had been empty moments before. More doors opened as I moved. Not fully. Just enough to show occupied rooms. Beds filled. Chairs no longer empty. The floor wasn't waking up. It was resuming. By the time I reached the nurse's station, the monitors were active. Heart rates scrolled steadily. Soft beeps filled the air, perfectly timed, calm and methodical. The sound blended with the rain, creating a rhythm that felt practiced, rehearsed. The maintenance workers were gone. Not vanished, just not there. Their tools lay where they'd left them. The pipe still leaked gently, water tapping into a bucket with soft persistence. I don't remember deciding to leave. I just remember walking. Fast at first, then running, the corridor stretching longer than it should have. Doors lining the walls no longer matched the numbers I'd logged. Some bore old department names scratched out and rewritten. Others had no labels at all. Behind me, footsteps followed. Not hurried. Not chasing. Keeping pace. When I reached the sealed doors, they were open wider than before. Light from the active hospital spilled through, cold and modern and safe. I crossed the threshold without looking back. The doors closed on their own. Administration blamed a power surge. Faulty wiring. Stress on old systems. The floor was resealed by morning, this time with concrete poured into the gaps. The leak was fixed from below. No one mentioned the lights. No one asked why my logs ended mid-page. They told us the floor would remain sealed permanently. That was months ago. But sometimes, during my night shifts, when the rain is steady and the hospital grows quiet, I hear it through the walls. The soft beeping of monitors. The distant roll of a cart. A call button chiming patiently, waiting for someone to answer. And I know the fourth floor is still there. Working. Waiting. And very much not empty. The first call came in the middle of a rain-soaked evening, the kind where the sky stays low and gray and the world feels muted, as if wrapped in damp cloth. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the lights dimmed, listening to the soft hiss of rain against the window when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made my breath catch. It was hers. Lena. Lena had been missing for almost a year. At first, I assumed it was a glitch. Phones do that sometimes, old contacts resurfacing, numbers recycled, systems misfiring. Still, my hand hovered over the screen longer than it should have. The rain seemed to quiet, as if listening with me. I let the phone ring until it stopped. When the silence returned, it felt heavier than before, like something unfinished had just brushed past me. Lena had vanished quietly. No struggle. No dramatic clues. She simply didn't show up for work one morning, didn't answer messages, didn't come home. Her car was found parked neatly outside her apartment, keys on the counter, groceries still in the fridge. The police called it a voluntary disappearance after months of nothing. We knew better, those of us who loved her. Lena didn't disappear. She stayed. She answered. She always answered. The second call came 2 nights later. Same name. Same number. The rain was heavier this time, tapping steadily against the glass, threading through the house like a memory that refused to fade. I answered before I could think better of it. There was no voice at first. Just the sound of rain. Softer than the rain outside, but unmistakably the same rhythm. Beneath it, I heard breathing, slow, careful, as if whoever was on the other end was afraid of being heard too clearly. Lena? I said quietly. My voice felt wrong in my mouth, like I was using it for something it wasn't meant to do anymore. The breathing paused. Then, faintly, I heard her say my name. It wasn't wrong exactly. It wasn't distorted or mechanical. It was her voice the way I remembered it late at night, tired and unguarded. But it carried no emotion. No relief. No confusion. Just recognition, as if she were reading it from somewhere rather than speaking it. The line went dead a second later. I didn't sleep that night. The rain continued until morning, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard her breathing again, perfectly in time with the weather. When daylight came, it felt thin and unreal, like it had arrived out of obligation rather than certainty. I contacted the police. They were patient, sympathetic, but unconvinced. Phone records showed the calls originated from Lena's number, but the location data was inconsistent. Sometimes it placed the call near cell towers that no longer existed. Sometimes it placed it nowhere at all. They told me not to answer again. I nodded. I knew I wouldn't listen. The calls continued. Not every night. Not predictably. Always during rain. Sometimes she would say my name. Sometimes she would ask simple questions, things Lena would have known the answers to. Is it still raining? Did you lock the door? Are you alone? I began to notice something else. She never spoke unless I spoke first. And when I stopped talking, she didn't fill the silence. She waited. Friends stopped coming over. They said the house felt strange, like the air was too still even when the rain was loud. I stopped correcting them when they said her name carefully, like it might hear us. I stopped explaining. One evening, during a slow, endless rainfall, I asked her where she was. The line crackled softly, rain whispering between us. When she answered, her voice sounded closer than it ever had before, like it wasn't traveling through a network at all. I'm where I answered last, she said. That didn't make sense, but it felt true in a way that settled uncomfortably into my chest. I thought about the last time I'd spoken to her before she disappeared. It had been raining then too. We'd talked on the phone late into the night, about nothing important. About being tired. About how quiet everything felt. After that call, things in my apartment began to change. Subtly. A chair angled slightly toward the corner where the signal was strongest. My phone warm even when I hadn't used it. Once, I found damp footprints near the window, leading nowhere, fading before they reached the middle of the room. I stopped checking the weather forecast. I didn't need to. I knew when she would call. I could feel the pressure in the air change, the way sound softened before the rain began. I started answering on the first ring. The calls grew longer. She began to remember things, shared jokes, old routines, details that no one else would know. But something was always missing. Context. Feeling. It was like listening to someone recite a life rather than live it. One night, the rain was so quiet it barely registered, just a fine mist against the windows. When she spoke, her voice didn't come through the phone. It came from the other side of the room. I didn't turn around. I answer because you call, she said gently. And you keep calling. My phone vibrated on the table, screen dark. They reopened her case recently. New reports. Other people. Other calls. Different names. Same pattern. Missing persons who still answered when it rained, voices preserved just enough to be convincing, anchored to the last moment someone reached for them and didn't let go. I still get the calls. Sometimes I let them ring now. Sometimes I don't. The rain always listens either way. And sometimes, late at night, when my phone is silent and the rain is steady, I feel the urge to dial her number myself. Just to hear the breathing. Just to know I'm still remembered on the other end. Because the worst part isn't that she answers. It's that one day, I might be the one who doesn't stop. The cemetery was never meant to be quiet. That's something people don't understand until they spend real time there. Even when no one is visiting, there are sounds, wind through dry grass, insects moving beneath the soil, distant traffic softened by distance. When I took the caretaker job, I learned to recognize those sounds the way you recognize a familiar voice in a crowded room. I knew what belonged. The rain changed everything. It had been raining steadily for days, not hard enough to flood, but enough to saturate the ground and press a damp weight into the air. The clouds stayed low, muting color and sound, turning the world into shades of gray and green. I worked late that evening, walking the grounds with my coat pulled tight, checking for fallen branches or disturbed markers. The rain made the headstones shine softly, each name reflecting a thin, watery light. Near the back of the cemetery was a newer section, fresh plots, evenly spaced, the soil still darker than the rest. That was where I heard it. At first, it blended in with the rain. A low sound, barely noticeable, like water moving through packed earth. I stopped walking, listening carefully. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, not quite matching the rhythm of rainfall. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it. I followed the sound to a grave that had been dug earlier that week. The burial had been delayed due to paperwork issues, so the plot remained open, covered by a temporary wooden frame and a tarp weighed down with stones. Rainwater pooled on the surface, dripping slowly through the fabric into the dark space below. The sound was coming from there. I told myself it was water settling. Air escaping from soaked soil. Anything that fit the world I understood. I leaned closer, careful not to step too near the edge. The smell of wet earth was strong, rich and heavy. Then, beneath the sound of rain, I heard something that made my breath slow and shallow. A voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't panicked. It was calm, almost tired, rising gently from the open grave as if the earth itself were speaking. I couldn't make out the words at first. Just the shape of them, carried upward through damp soil and darkness. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for the rain to soak through my coat. Long enough for the voice to become clearer. It was asking a question. Not pleading. Not calling for help. Just asking, in a quiet, conversational tone, as if expecting an answer. I stepped back. My heart didn't race. That frightened me later, the way my body accepted what it was hearing without protest. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, the way isolation can twist familiar sounds into something else. I secured the tarp more tightly and left the section, my boots leaving dark prints that quickly filled with water. That night, I dreamed of soil pressing gently against my chest, not suffocating, just close. I dreamed of rain filtering down through layers of earth, cooling my skin. And I dreamed of speaking, not to be heard, but because silence felt heavier than words. The next day, I checked the grave again. The tarp was undisturbed. The rain continued. Everything looked as it should. I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. Almost. Because as I turned to leave, I heard the voice again. This time, it said my name. It didn't sound wrong. It didn't sound distorted or distant. It sounded the way a person sounds when they know you well enough not to explain themselves. I knelt at the edge of the grave before I realized what I was doing, my hands sinking into the wet grass. I'm here, the voice said softly. You always come back. I asked who it was. There was a pause. The rain filled it patiently. I don't remember, the voice replied. But I remember waiting. After that, the voice came whenever it rained. Sometimes faint, sometimes clearer, always calm. It never asked to be let out. Never expressed fear. It spoke about the weight of the earth, the way time felt different beneath it. How moments stretched, then folded in on themselves. How memories thinned but never disappeared completely. I checked the burial records obsessively. The plot was assigned to someone who had died suddenly, with no family able to attend the burial yet. The coffin hadn't arrived. The grave was empty. Officially. I began staying later at the cemetery, lingering near that section when the rain fell. I listened. Sometimes I responded. The voice never thanked me. It didn't need to. It spoke as though being heard was simply part of how things worked. One evening, during a particularly gentle rainfall, I asked how long it had been there. Longer than the marker, it said. Shorter than the ground. I stopped asking questions after that. The ground around the grave began to settle more quickly than expected. The edges softened. The soil sank inward slightly, as if something below were shifting into a more comfortable position. No one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't comment. The burial was eventually cancelled. The plot was reassigned. Filled in. Leveled. The voice didn't stop. It came from beneath the finished ground now, softer but still present, threaded through the sound of rain. Sometimes I hear it from other graves too, faint echoes carried through the soil, voices that sound familiar without being recognizable. I still work there. I still walk the grounds when it rains. I listen more than I used to. Because once you realize the graves aren't always empty, you start to understand something else. Some voices don't come from the dead. They come from the waiting. And the earth is very good at holding on to those who speak back. I didn't mean to go back. That's the first thing I should say, because it makes the whole story feel like a choice I made, like I decided to return to something I already knew was wrong. But I didn't. Not really. The house called me back the way certain sounds or smells can pull you into a memory you didn't want to revisit. The call came in the form of a text message, a simple line from an old number I hadn't seen in years, asterisk, you left your camera here. Asterisk, it was the kind of message that makes your stomach drop even if you don't know why. The number wasn't saved. The message didn't say who it was. It didn't even have a name. Just the words, as if the sender assumed I would know who they were and why the camera mattered. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the weight of the rain outside my window. It was one of those nights where the rain didn't fall in drops. It fell in sheets. It hit the glass with a steady rhythm that sounded like someone tapping their fingernails in time with a song you couldn't remember. The street outside was blurred by water, the lights smeared into soft halos. It made the world look like a painting that had been smudged by wet fingers. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to. I wanted to pretend the message wasn't real. I wanted to pretend that the house, the one I'd promised myself I would never return to, was gone from my life. But the camera had been mine. And I had left it behind. It was a stupid thing to care about, I know. A camera is just an object. It's a tool. It shouldn't have the power to pull you back into the past. But I had spent months saving for that camera. I had used it to document the kind of life I wanted to remember, the kind of life I thought I was building. The camera had been with me through everything, the small moments I wanted to hold on to, the quiet evenings I thought were safe, the nights when the house felt empty and the silence felt like a comfort. The house was in the suburbs, on the edge of a neighborhood that had been built quickly and cheaply. It was the kind of area where the streets were straight and the lawns were tidy, where people kept their curtains closed but still pretended to be open. The house itself was older than the others, a two-story with a slanted roof and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. It had been sold to us at a price that seemed too good to be true. The real estate agent had said the previous owner moved away suddenly. He didn't say why. We moved in anyway. We were young and tired and convinced that our new life was beginning. My partner and I had spent the first few weeks fixing the place up, painting walls, replacing old fixtures, making it ours. We had taken pictures of everything. We thought we were creating a home. The photos are all blurred now. That's what I realized when I opened the camera again. It was in a small box on my kitchen counter, wrapped in a towel as if it had been protected from the world. The message had said it was here. The box was here. The camera was here. I had held it in my hands, the way you hold something precious, and I had expected to see the images I remembered. Instead, I saw only smudged shapes. I turned it on. The screen flickered, then displayed the last photo I had taken. It was a picture of the living room, taken from the doorway, with the couch and the window and the old clock on the wall. The photo was blurred as if the camera had been shaking, but the blur wasn't random. It was deliberate. The edges of the objects were soft, as if someone had pressed a finger against the lens and dragged it across the image. I scrolled through the photos. Every single one was blurred. Not because of motion. Not because of poor focus. Not because of low light. The blur looked intentional, like the camera itself had been trying to hide something. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling a coldness creep up my spine. The rain outside continued to fall. The sound filled the room, and I realized that it was the only sound that mattered. It made everything else feel distant, as if the world beyond my walls had been pushed away. I tried to remember the photos. I tried to remember the moments they captured. The way the sunlight used to come through the windows in the morning. The way the kitchen smelled when we cooked. The way the house felt alive when we were there together. But the memories were hazy. They were there, just out of reach, like a face you can't quite recall in a dream. I could remember the shape of the rooms, the color of the walls, the sound of the floors creaking. But the details were missing. The details were blurred. I started to feel like I was looking at someone else's life. I took the camera into my hands again and looked closer. I pressed the button to zoom in. The blur didn't change. It remained soft, like a fog over everything. Then I noticed something else. In every photo, in the same place, there was a dark shape. It was always in the background, always near a doorway or a window. Sometimes it was just a shadow on the wall. Sometimes it was a dark smudge that looked like it had been placed there. Sometimes it was the faint outline of a person, though the details were impossible to make out. It was always there. Always watching. I felt my heart begin to race. I tried to tell myself it was my mind playing tricks. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. But the feeling of being watched was too strong. It wasn't just in the photos. It was in the room. It was in the air. The next day, I went back to the house. I told myself it was to retrieve the camera. That was the only reason I needed. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself I was doing something simple and practical. But the truth was, I needed to know what had happened. I needed to understand why the photos were blurred. I needed to know why the house felt like it had never been empty. When I arrived, the house looked the same as it always had. The porch sagged slightly. The windows were dusty. The lawn was overgrown. The front door was still locked. I had a key. I had kept one. I didn't know why. I didn't know why I still had it, but I did. I stepped inside. The air felt different. It was colder, heavier. It smelled faintly of damp wood and old paper. The house was quiet in the way a closed room is quiet. Not peaceful. Not calm. Quiet like a held breath. The living room was still there. The couch was still in the same place. The old clock still hung on the wall, though the hands were frozen at a time I couldn't remember. The walls were still painted the same color. Everything looked normal. But the feeling was wrong. I walked through the rooms slowly, as if I didn't want to disturb anything. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the sound echoed through the house like a warning. I reached the hallway. And I stopped. There was a photo on the wall. It was one of the pictures we had taken when we first moved in. A family photo, the kind you put in a frame and hang in the living room. My partner and I standing in front of the couch, smiling, our arms around each other. The photo was blurred. The faces were indistinct, like someone had smeared the image with a finger. The background was soft and hazy. But there was something else in the photo. A dark shape in the corner. Not a shadow. Not a stain. A shape that looked like a person standing behind us, close enough to touch us, but somehow not part of the image. It was as if the camera had captured something that wasn't supposed to be there. I felt my stomach drop. I reached out and touched the frame. The glass was cold. I pulled the photo out and held it up to the light. The blur didn't change. The dark shape remained. It was always there. Always watching. Always close. I set the photo back down carefully, as if it might move if I didn't. I continued through the house. Every room had photos. Photos on shelves. Photos on tables. Photos in frames. Photos in albums. Photos on the walls. Every photo was blurred. Every photo had the same dark shape. I went to the bedroom. The bed was made neatly, as if someone had been sleeping there recently. The sheets were smooth. The pillow looked untouched. The room smelled faintly of rain. On the nightstand, there was a camera bag. It wasn't mine. It was the kind of bag that comes with a camera when you buy it new. The kind with a strap and a zipper and a small pocket for accessories. It was old, worn, and it looked like it had been used for years. I opened it. Inside was a camera. A different camera. It looked similar to mine, but older. It had a film roll inside. The film was labeled with a date. The date was the night I moved in. I pulled the camera out and held it in my hands. It felt heavy. It felt like something that had been waiting. I turned it on. The screen flickered. And then it showed a photo. It was a photo of the living room. The blur was there, but the dark shape was clearer. It was closer. It was standing in the doorway. It was looking directly at the camera. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I looked up. The doorway was empty. The hallway was empty. The house was empty. But I could feel something behind me. A presence. A quiet, patient presence, like someone waiting for me to notice them. I turned slowly. The room was empty. But the air felt thick. I felt my skin prickle, like someone had just walked past me. I took a step back. The floorboard creaked. The sound was too loud. It echoed. And then, from the hallway, I heard something. A soft, quiet sound. Like a whisper. It wasn't words. Not yet. It was just a breath, a sound that could have been the wind. But it came from inside the walls. I stood still, listening. The whisper came again. This time, it sounded like a voice. A voice that was too calm. A voice that sounded like it was speaking from far away. "Don't take the photos," the voice seemed to say. I felt my heart pound. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry. The voice came again. Asterisk, don't look at them. Asterisk, I looked at the camera in my hands. I looked at the photos. I looked at the blurred faces. I looked at the dark shape. And I realized something. The photos weren't blurred because of a camera flaw. They were blurred because someone didn't want to be seen. Someone didn't want to be captured. Someone was hiding in the background of every memory. I put the camera down. I backed away from the nightstand. I walked out of the bedroom. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been. The walls seemed to stretch. The light was dimmer. The air felt colder. I reached the living room. And I saw something that made my stomach turn. On the couch, there was a photo album. It wasn't ours. It was old. It was thick. The cover was worn. It looked like it had been handled by many hands over many years. I opened it. The pages were filled with photos. Every photo was blurred. Every photo had the dark shape. But as I flipped through, I noticed something that made my breath catch. The photos weren't all of the house. Some were of other places. Some were of other people. Some were of families I didn't recognize. Some were of children. Some were of strangers. But the dark shape was in every one. Always in the background. Always watching. I flipped further. The photos became older. The paper became yellowed. The blur remained. And then, I saw something that made my vision go blurry, not because of the photos, but because of my own eyes. There was a photo of me. Not from the time I lived in the house. Not from the time I was a child. A photo of me taken recently. A photo taken in the rain. A photo taken with my camera. The blur was there, but the dark shape was clear. It was standing behind me. And it was looking at me. The next photo was of the same moment. The same angle. But the dark shape was closer. And in the next photo, it was standing right next to me. And in the next, it was in front of me. Blocking my view. I felt my hands start to shake. I closed the album. I backed away. The whisper came again, softer this time, like it was right behind my ear. "You can't keep looking," it said. I turned. The hallway was empty. The living room was empty. The house was empty. But I could feel the presence. I could feel it in the walls. In the air. In the shadows. I ran to the door. I grabbed the handle. It was locked. I tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. The house felt like it was holding me inside. I looked around, desperate. I saw the camera on the nightstand. I saw the photo album on the couch. I saw the blurred photos on the walls. I realized, with a cold clarity, that the house didn't want me to leave. The house wanted me to remember. The house wanted me to keep the photos. The house wanted me to keep looking. I backed away from the door and sat down on the floor. The rain outside continued to fall. The sound was steady, unbroken. And the whisper came again. This time, it was clearer. It sounded like a voice I knew. A voice I hadn't heard in years. A voice I had forgotten. A voice that sounded like mine. "Don't take the photos," the voice said. Asterisk, "don't look at them." Asterisk, I held my head in my hands, trying to block out the sound. But the whisper kept coming. And as it came, I realized something else. The photos weren't just blurred. They were changing. The dark shape was moving closer. The blur was shifting. The images were becoming more focused. As if the house was slowly letting the truth come into view. As if it was slowly allowing the memory to become clear. I looked at the camera again. I looked at the photos. I looked at the album. And I understood. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost. The house was haunted by a memory. A memory that didn't want to be remembered. A memory that had been hidden behind blur and shadow. A memory that was now waking up. And as the rain continued to fall, I realized the most terrifying thing of all: the house wasn't just a place. It was a lens. And the moment I left, the blur would follow me. Because the dark shape wasn't in the photos. The dark shape was in me. And it was still watching. Still waiting. Still whispering. Asterisk, "don't take the photos." Asterisk, asterisk, "don't look at them." Asterisk, and I know, now, that I never really left the house at all. I just carried it with me. In every blurred memory. In every photograph. In every quiet moment when the rain falls and the world becomes soft and indistinct. Because the house is still there. And the last thing I remember before the blur takes over is the sound of the whisper, calm and patient, like someone speaking from the other side of a wall. "We're still in the picture."